We've had the room much busier, but then you've got all kinds of problems with audiences not wanting to be in the clips.
Okay.
So we're just going to film. This is for a TED Talk.
Brilliant.
Or at least a
Great.
submission for a TED Talk. Yeah, they've agreed to have a look at a proper film.
Okay.
Brilliant.
And so we actually thought, rather than do one earlier when it was busier, it would be better to be undistracted, so to speak.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind,
No, don't mind
and
at all.
I'm very happy to run through what I'm doing. It's going to Edinburgh, the show's going to Edinburgh.
Oh, fantastic.
And yeah, there's a bigger interest up there.
Edinburgh
Well,
Fringe, I
because it's
guess.
an international festival. There's a lot of people just go for this kind of thing, lectures, public information.
Yeah.
Brighton's geared a bit more toward comedy, theatre,
Okay.
Evening shows, and at the weekends kids shows and stuff like that.
Right, yeah.
But you get a book fair up there as well, so there are literate people that are interested in social policy and so forth. So we're happy with small numbers here.
Is he?
Rodney very kindly, Rodney's a comedian. I'm a comedian too, usually. But this is such a serious subject. I do jokes about drug addiction and alcoholism, but I'm punching up, and I don't punch down at the addicts. I'm punching up at the language being used by addiction professionals who are, in my view, making the problem worse. And so what I've done is assemble several of the major criticisms. Yeah, I taught myself in universities, various universities in America for decades, and one of the things I did notice was that sometimes students would be cross or confused, or both even, and because they were boiling, they weren't listening to anything else that got said. So I would far sooner, if you've got a query, question, criticism or whatever, just let me know and we can deal with it on the hoof. I have had sessions that were 45 minutes talking, 15 Q&A, and they work well too. But with a small audience, I think it's better just to... Can I just show you that? While
Yes, please.
This is a book I published at the beginning of 2022, and the talk is in essence a response to the major criticisms I received upon its publication. And there were 2 or 3 of them, and I want to address them and then look at the language that the medical profession has used and we, the general population, have absorbed into the mainstream, if you like, of our culture, so that you find it in journal, not only academic journals, you'll find it in newspapers and media outlets, Sky News, BBC News. They use phrases that are taken from medicine and that are misleading and, I'm arguing, dangerous. So this is, in a sense, the setup. One of the myths I attack, and I think is a very important one, there's a story people like to circulate that a drug addict overdoses, for example, dies, and the rest of the drug addicts, they hear about it. And the myth is that, please come on, the myth is that the other addicts all rush around to whoever dealt the drug, because if it's good enough to kill somebody, then they must have the fire, as they call it, right? And so they all queue up to get hold of some of this fabulous gear. Now, what I should say is, I have been a heroin addict and an alcoholic at different decades and in different continents. But nevertheless, I have experienced both. And I can assure you that this myth is a dangerously misleading one. This is not what happens when somebody overdoses. People don't think that must be great smack, that guy's selling, I've got to get some. What they do instead is ask questions like this before they go anywhere. They ask, who was the person who overdosed? Regular, out of town, male, female, because our sizes, if you like, make a difference. Just come out of rehab, because calculations can go wrong. What you were shooting up before you went in can kill you when you come out 3 months later, and so on. And did the dealer have a beef with whoever it was who overdosed? Did they do it on purpose? In other words, half a dozen questions would be asked about the nature of the individual who overdosed before anybody started thinking about the potency of the substance. And my argument is, for the last 150 years, we collectively, Western society, has behaved like those frenzied junkies who are only interested in the substance, who've raced around to get hold of the actual product. Whereas I'm saying what we should be doing is acting like those more cautious, experienced drug addicts who ask questions about the individual who took the drugs. We've turned our attention away from the individual, and we have looked for the last 150 years for reasons to excuse individuals because they take drugs or because they drink alcoholically. My own position is that this is a moral issue, and this is why the book has been criticised. The problem we face, and this is a wider problem, and this is why I think the people are interested, it's a much wider problem. It's very difficult for modern people to separate morality from religion. And so as soon as you start talking about alcoholism being a moral issue, people immediately summon up images of sort of rabid evangelists and Methodists and thou shalt nots and so forth. And I would like to establish a sense of morality that is completely disconnected from anything to do with religion. I want to argue that it's morally wrong to be dependent on a substance that tells you the world is other than it is. The whole point of alcohol and heroin are to change, elevate our perceptions and our moods. That's why people drink them. That's why, just to stay with alcohol, which more people are familiar with, people drink at social occasions because they're nervous. And this is very well known, if you like. The phrase Dutch courage, you've heard this, for alcohol. Do you know where it comes from? No, no reason why you would. In the 17th century, the English fought more wars with the Dutch than they did even with the French. And what the English sailors noted was that while they got their tot of rum at breakfast, the Dutch were given their shot of gin just before they went into battle. So the English started taunting them that their courage was Dutch courage, artificial courage. It came out of a bottle. In the 18th century, there was a fashion for Dutch bolsters. And these are things you put at the head of the bed, not quite like pillows, but more decorative than useful, but the rich had them. And the rich ones were stuffed with superior materials that made for a very relaxing sort of chill. And the poorer middle classes who aspired to be like them, they bought bolsters full of less expensive materials. And these were called Dutch bolsters, because they were, in fact, fake, untrue. False is like Dutch courage, it's not true. You have heard, are you a couple?
Yeah.
Once upon a time, maybe, before you were a couple, you went Dutch. And what would that mean if you ever had gone Dutch? What would you understand by it?
Yeah, divided half.
Exactly. And the reason we call it going Dutch is because we've lost the word treat. What used to be there was Dutch treat, right? And it wasn't a treat because you were both paying your own way. In other words, it was a false, a fake treat. And at the heart, really, of what I have to say is that alcohol gives a courage that is illusory and transitory. And yet, there are people who drink enough of it to become dependent on it. But it's only a certain percentage of people. It's not the alcohol. When I applied to do this show, there was a lovely woman running the, whatever aspect of Fringe I was connected with. And she wrote to me when she read the abstract for the lecture. She said, "Are you aware, Dr. McCarron, that the Walrus is a public house?" And I had to think for a minute what a public house was. It seemed like a contradiction in terms. It took me a minute to realise she meant a pub. A pub. And I wrote back and said, yes, I'm aware it's a pub. I want the show in a pub because I want to dramatise that for me, there is nothing wrong with alcohol. Prohibition made a huge error. Most people acknowledge it was a disaster. Right now, all we did was carry on that disaster into the war on drugs. And we made war again on a substance without thinking about the individuals who abuse it. That the issue is not with the substances. This is what's killing us. Scotland now, for the 9th year in a row, has recorded its increase in drug-related deaths. 9 years in a row, that's climbed. There are now more people dying of drug overdoses in Scotland per capita than anywhere else in Europe. A nation of 4 million people, the highest number of drug-related deaths in the entire of Europe. One of the reasons for that, one of the reasons for that, is that they have reduced the stigma around drug addiction so successfully that it's quite normal to be a drug addict in Scotland. And therefore, per capita, the numbers of drug deaths are increasing. They won't see it. They remind me, the Scottish government remind me of those caricature English tourists who say to the waiter in English, "Can I have a sandwich or something?" When the waiter doesn't understand the caricature would have it, they just shout the same thing louder, right? That's what the Scots are doing. Every year, they chuck more money at saying the same thing, and more people die. Their argument is, reduce the stigma, and more people will go into treatment. That's the argument, right? There's no evidence for this. And what I want to argue, and one of the reasons I've got into so much trouble, and I'll explain some of the trouble in a moment, is that I'm arguing, contrary to 150 years worth of received wisdom, addicts are not fleeing pain or trauma so much as they are pursuing pleasure. That the pleasure that comes with shooting up heroin is unimaginably blissful. It is the best thing, the best thing. Same with alcohol. The feeling of getting intoxicated for the alcoholic is beyond value. That's why they keep drinking till they pass out, or the money runs out, or they end up in jail, or whatever it might be. You can't stop them. Not because, as some people say, a switch has been clipped, or the alcohol has ignited some genetic malfunction or something of this kind. No, it's because they love that feeling of illusory courage, of confidence. I was talking to an alcoholic, a woman, some years back. She said, when she'd stopped. She said when she drank, she felt wittier, tittier, and prettier. And that's why she did it. And she carried on doing it. And so, the notion that morality might be an issue here is associated with Victorians. People will say to me, your views are Victorian. Now they're wrong in that. My views predate the Victorians. The Victorians are the ones who've landed us in the mess we're in now. It's the Victorians who start to believe that there may be a scientific dimension to understanding addiction. Could you guess, within a decade or two, when the first book written by a medical doctor was published claiming that addiction to alcohol was a disease? There's no earthly reason why you'd know, but just give it a guess.
I couldn't even guess.
Okay, yes.
Couldn't even guess.
50s.
1950s.
Yeah.
Okay, he's giving you a lead there, so
1970s.
1970s. Okay, Rodney.
I know the answer.
Oh, you know the answer. Okay, I forgot. Yeah, beautiful. Yes, the correct answer is 1785. 1785.
Do you know? Can you say the doctor's name?
Yes, Dr. Benjamin Rush.
Okay.
Dr. Benjamin Rush in 1785. He published a book in which he claimed that the inability to stop drinking, habitual inebriation, the phrase they used, was a disease. And then in 1805, a Scots doctor, James Trotter, he wrote a book, which also we have no way of knowing whether the two men's work was known or anything like that. He published a book in which he argued the same. And Hogg was, at that time, the chief surgeon of the British Navy, which was the biggest navy in the world. Benjamin Rush's eminence is further established by the fact he was a signatory of the American Declaration of Independence. This is how highly he was thought of in the Americas at that time. And since then, if you like, since the end of the 18th century, the belief that alcoholism or drug addiction are diseases of some kind has filtered its way down until for many people it's a fact that it's a disease and that it's a medical, therefore it's a medical issue. The word alcoholism itself was not used until 1839, and that word was coined by a Swedish medical doctor. And from that moment on, alcoholism and drug addiction have been under the aegis, within the purview, if you like, of the medical profession. On the back of my book here, I just read a sentence. Throughout the book, I reject the claims of the medical profession as embodied by the American Medical Association that drug addiction and alcoholism are diseases, and I further argue that they do not have the authority to tell hundreds of millions of Americans that addiction is not a moral failing. Something to remind ourselves about doctors is that they are trained to avoid making moral judgments. We aren't. It's not up to the medical profession to tell us that addiction is not a moral failing. That's down to us, not them. So I want to show how some of their language and terminology has become part of ordinary speech in a way that, to me, is contributing to the problem. You take a phrase, self-medicate. I don't know if you've come across this. She self-medicated with heroin. He self-medicated after his divorce and so on. it's worth bearing in mind here, neither alcohol or heroin or any of the opioid derivatives or anything like that are not medicines. It's therefore literally impossible to self-medicate using them. So the question then should be, but never has been asked, why use it when it's so clearly, factually incorrect? And the answer is to authenticate the addict's experience. It's to turn it into a medical experience rather than, if you like, a hedonistic one. It's to make it medical. I don't want to be misunderstood here. If, God forbid, someone was to fall down these stairs because they drunk too much and broke their leg, and a cry went out, is there a doctor in the house? I'd stay where I was. I know perfectly well they don't want a doctor of philosophy. They want a medical doctor who can knit that bone, who can do this. We need medical professionals, but their job is reactive. They respond to what's in front of them. The patient presents, they use their skills to heal. But that doesn't give them any insight at all into the causes of addiction. Why should it? Why should we ask it of them? Their job is to patch them up, not to understand how they got into that state. So we look at self-medicate, we think of another word like, for example, what word do you think people use if somebody hadn't had a drink for a few years, and then they started drinking again? What do people say of them?
That fell off the wagon.
They fell off the wagon would be colloquial. But there's no word, in fact I prefer that, but they don't say that. They say relapse, yes, sadly they say she's relapsed. Now relapsed is a medical term and means to go back to that original illness, if you like. But they weren't ill. Relapse, therefore, is an inaccurate description of what it is they're doing. They are, as I always say, picking up a drink again. They've started to drink again. Falling off the wagon. And what wagon is it that people fall off, you know? That's the water wagon. It was used throughout pre-Prohibition, and the prohibitionists would turn up in town with carts laden with drinking water, and so to fall off that was to pick up a drink again. But you can see the desire to keep it medicalised, and so what word I haven't had an alcoholic drink in many years. And what word do people use to describe me? I'm what kind of an alcoholic? Recovering alcoholic. Again, something I very much dispute. I'm not recovering from alcoholism. There's nothing to recover from. I drank too much. That's not recovering from anything. What I'd like to suggest is this. There was a book written by an English philosopher called Gilbert Ryle, a book called The Concept of Mind. And in it he developed notions of the dispositional qualities of various substances. So if I was to imagine, we would imagine you two having a cup of tea at your kitchen table, and for some reason some malicious kid next door throws a stone, fires a BB gun pellet through your window, and the bullet carries on, rock, whatever it is, hits the cup of tea, and the tea spills over the sugar cubes you were about to put into the tea, right? Now we know what happens with the glass and the sugar cubes. The stone does not leave a small round hole in an intact pane of glass. The entire pane shatters, right? That's its dispositional quality. When circumstances change, i.e. a stone gets lobbed through it, it reverts to its dispositional nature, which is to shatter. When liquid hits the sugar cubes, it reverts to its dispositional nature status, which is to melt, to be absorbed by the liquid. Now this for me is what alcoholics and drug addicts are like. They're not recovering from anything. They are dispositional addicts. This is why they relapse so often. They have a row with their wife, with their husband, with their boss, with their children. Something happens to change the situation and they pick up a drink again because that's their disposition. They don't relapse. They're not in recovery. All of these terms, if you like, rehabilitation, the word rehabilitation, the word treatment, these are both medical terms. Rehabilitation means to restore to former health. It comes straight from medical dictionaries, if you like. There's a whole range of medical words and phrases that are used wrongly. Not just, this is not a matter of interpretation, this is a matter of, well, no, that's just wrong. And there are a number of phrases medical profession also use, the courts of law use, and the public use, which, including us, if you like, anybody who's not a medical doctor or a therapist or something of that nature, we use them, and they too do enormous damage. And I'm thinking now of a few that you've probably almost certainly have heard in the course of your lives. Something like, sadly, I read a lot of obituaries, mainly young people in the United States. It was particularly true during what they called the OxyContin epidemic. I don't know if you've seen the Netflix. There's been various documentaries on the Sackler family and the selling of OxyContin and so forth. A lot of people died. And you read in these obituaries of young women and young men, 21, 22, 23, so upsetting. One of the phrases that's most habitual there is, she fell in with the wrong crowd. Okay, so what I'd like to say is that nobody in the history of humanity ever fell in with the wrong crowd. You have to audition to get into the wrong crowd. Does anybody know what fall in means on the parade ground? If you're a soldier and you're told to fall in, what does it mean?
I think get in line.
Exactly.
Regimental lines.
Exactly. Fall in means do exactly what all the other soldiers around you are doing. Don't deviate from it in any way whatsoever. It's everybody else who falls in. All the people who do the right thing, they fall in. The people who go looking for heroin, people who go looking for the kids who are drinking and smoking, they don't fall in. They go looking. They get accepted if they audition satisfactorily. Nobody falls in. Why don't they ever say, she joined the wrong crowd? She made the mistake of hooking up with the wrong crowd. But no, the verb is always fell, because fallen is more of an accident than seeking something out. So the innocence of the victim, if you like, of the poor heroin addict, the poor alcoholic, is maintained through the false use of that single verb. And they all do much the same job. He began experimenting with drugs at university. No, he didn't. He didn't start experimenting with drugs. He started taking them. He started using them. He started sampling them until he found the one that he liked best or that he could most afford. Sadly, if you're reading an obituary, that was probably heroin. But this again is not experimenting. But you put experiment in the context of a university or a high school, and it gives it that quasi-scientific dimension associated with healthy young people. Of course they want to experiment and try out the world. They may even make mistakes. Yes, it could be a mistake to shoot up heroin once. But nobody gets addicted to one shot of heroin. You have to keep coming back. You have to like it. And you go back, you go back, you go back, until eventually you're dependent. It is very, very straightforward. As I've said in my book, addiction itself is a very straightforward behavioural disorder. It's the wrong way to react. What's complicated about it is the language that's sprung up to describe it. And that's what I'm doing. Attacking, querying, interrogating the language used to describe addiction. Because I'm arguing that's what's keeping us where we are. A mess that's got worse every single year. For 150 years we've been doing the same thing, and the problem has got worse. I mean, in any other walk of life, could we imagine that happening? For 150 years we do the same thing, and the death toll gets higher every year. And so the what do you call it? The result is to say the same thing louder, to spend more money on tactics that don't work. I mean, another phrase thrown around and never questioned. Bill has battled alcoholism for the last 20 years. No, Bill hasn't battled alcoholism for the last 20 years. He's surrendered every single day. There's no battle here. It's just a series of ignominious, abject defeats, one after the other, day after day. Bill has been portrayed as some kind of warrior, battling addiction. There is no battle. Whenever he sees a bottle, he picks it up. If he's battling anything, it's his urge not to drink, which he can't control. He can't master that. It will be far fairer and truer to say, for 20 years, Bill has unsuccessfully struggled to remain sober. But that's not how it is presented. Alcoholics are battling with addiction, struggling with addiction, in the grip of addiction, i.e. something they have brought upon themselves. We're being told they're battling with. The battle begins with sobriety. That's hard. That's a battle. But right up to that point, it's a picnic. And she suffers from, listen out, again, these phrases are so ubiquitous, they're so widespread, we've stopped noticing them. But to hear, for example, to read, she suffers from heroin addiction. There's a lady lives in my apartment block, very old woman, she must be in her late 80s, I guess. She has arthritis really, really badly. Her hands are like claws. And I take her, she lets me know every so often when her recycling is, and when she wants a chat, basically. And I nip around, I don't pretend to be a model citizen here. But I have sat with her, and I have learned a great deal about her arthritis, a lot more than I particularly want to know. But I do know this. And severe winters, her knuckles get so tight that the skin on them cracks and she bleeds. She drops blood all over the floor because her hands, she's in agony. She said the painkillers don't do anything. She's in agony like this. Her whole body is arthritic and so nobody doubts that she is suffering from arthritis. But she also suffers because of arthritis. She can no longer read because she can't hold a book anymore. So although she's read for her entire life now, she needs these audio books. She can't knit or sew, which again she did for decades, because her fingers just can't handle it, and so on. This is suffering because of arthritis. My argument as far as the drug addict and the alcoholic goes is that they suffer only because of their addictions, not from them. They are not suffering from addiction. Nobody who knocks back 9 pints of cider, tops it off with a few joints before bed, is suffering. Nobody who shoots up heroin for those blissful hours, they're not suffering. They might suffer the next day when they've got no money, when their wife's thrown them out, when their husband's thrown them out, when their kids are crying, when there's nothing to eat. But that's not suffering from addiction. It's suffering because of it. We need to understand those distinctions. At the moment, what we have is essentially a horde, hundreds of thousands of people who can't cope, who are drinking themselves senseless every night or shooting up heroin at every opportunity. And we have been persuaded and bullied by the medical profession and successive governments to see them as victims. Addicts aren't victims. They create victims. This is a major shift in our thinking. I think alcoholics and drug addicts need all the support we can give them. They need help, of course they do, they need support. But the support they get should be geared around them being unable to deal with the real world without being tranquilized or drugged in some way or other. They should not be seen in any kind of special way. They don't suffer from any particular condition. Alcoholism and drug addiction are just ways they're making visible that they can't cope. So have you got any questions? You right on.
I've got a
Yes.
few thoughts, yeah.
Yes, love to hear them.
So you talk about that people aren't drinking because they've got pain and trauma. People aren't using drugs to treat their pain and trauma. But that we are all dispositioned
Yes.
to drink or drugs. Is that right?
Well, when you say we, I say alcoholics and drug addicts.
Okay. So why
Yeah.
aren't we all using it then?
Yes.
Why aren't we all addicts?
Exactly. So,
If
Yeah.
the addicts aren't doing it for pain and trauma,
Yep.
then why aren't we all doing it?
Because they find, is that wine?
That is.
They find more pleasure in what that wine does to them than you do. I mean, my guess is, if you realise, my God, that's the time I've got to go, you could leave it there. Half a glass of wine, you could leave it there. An alcoholic, just the idea of leaving half a glass, because they attach so much more value to what it can do to you. Only the very fucked up become alcoholics or drug addicts. They don't need, you don't need, I'm assuming.
And what are they fucked up from?
Well, that could be indeed poor childhood.
Pain and trauma.
Indeed it could.
Okay.
In which case I say, fair enough, but don't forget the 90% of others who underwent even worse trauma than you and didn't become alcoholic.
So here, within with what you're saying is, we're not being explicit here, saying all addicts have been through pain and trauma and that's why they drink. We are saying that everyone can go through pain and trauma,
Yep.
but they don't all end up addicts.
That's
so
right.
what's the other proportion?
The other people who don't become addicts.
Well, the people that haven't been through pain and trauma and then they become addicts.
Yes, because
You know,
because as I say, you need to be fucked up. That's to say, you need to feel ill at ease in society. You need to lack confidence, and rather than build it by going out there and engaging soberly with the world, you knock them back to get the courage and then find you can't function without the substance you've grown to rely on to give you that social presence. And most people who are better balanced, it seems to me, mentally, who are more socially integrated, who are not so self-obsessed or selfish or narcissistic, these to me are all vices that drive alcoholism and drug addiction. That they are character failings, as they've always been seen as, since the very first mention in Western literature of drug addiction is in Homer, and we think this is published somewhere between 800 and 500 BC. And Homer's view here on drug addiction is very moral. It's wrong. And he takes the sailors who eat the lotus flower, drags them onto the ship, ties them to the mast, so they can't go back. In 1826, Tennyson, the poet, English poet Tennyson, he takes the same episode from Homer and writes a poem called The Lotus Eaters. And in The Lotus Eaters, he gives the sailors the freedom to choose whether they'll stay on the island and take the drugs or leave. And it's very clear that Tennyson sees the drug-addicted sailors as morally failing, as doing something wrong. To lie on the island, it's the most beautiful poem, by the way, but to lie on the island in dull content and ignore what Tennyson refers to as the world of wind and wave and oar, the rowing, is a dereliction of duty and responsibility, and it's just morally wrong. And so, it's also worth noticing the collected edition of Freud's, the standard edition of Freud's collected works runs to 22 volumes. It's like on a library shelf, it's sort of like that. He mentions alcoholism twice in his entire career, and he wrote right up until his death. And he advises his fellow therapists to avoid alcoholics, not because he says they're impossible to cure. He says because they're a waste of our time. They don't need our expertise. It's a very simple, maladaptive behavioural disorder. It's the wrong way to react to something bad that happened to you. That's it for him. He said it's adolescent and childish. He likens it to masturbation and instant self-gratification. And this is what needs to be noted, I think. If you are deeply unhappy, you're an alcoholic and you're deeply unhappy, you could go to a bar, whack 20 quid down and say, make me feel better now. No work needs to go into it. Doesn't matter what you're feeling unhappy about. Just say it was a row with your wife. Instead of talking it over with your wife, you go to the pub and you knock back alcohol that makes you feel I don't fucking need it. Who needs that fucking bitch always nagging me and so on? It's an easy, cheap, relatively speaking, cheap way out of developing as an adult. Most alcoholics' emotional development is arrested at the moment they become addicted, because addiction is not a real life. The substance you're ingesting is making you view the world in a different way, not the real way, the one we're living in now. If somebody came up who had, 4 pints, 5 pints, whatever, this whole room would look different, and everything about it would be different, because they would be drunk, or at least well on their way, depending on their capacity. But yes, I think we need to acknowledge, and we won't do it, we need to acknowledge that the alcoholic and the drug addict are maladjusted people. And they find a quick, cheap, easy, blissful escape from the world of anxiety, family, jobs, responsibilities, in a substance that becomes so important to them that you can see some of them now on the streets dying from it. They're dying lying in shop doorways, dying because they would rather drink than live. People say to me, because I say this is all a matter of choice, and I say nobody chooses to live on the streets like that. Like you, me, I'm an idiot. I'm saying, of course they don't choose to live like that, but they chose every single drink along the way that led them there. They chose that over giving up drinking. They chose that over stopping using heroin. You have to have when people say nobody chooses to live like that, you need to ask that as opposed to what? As opposed to what? Stopping drinking. Then they choose to live like that. That's how powerful the allure of intoxication is to some people. A small percentage, 10% maybe we think, 12, something like that. The huge majority of people, they don't. They don't find that kind of value in it. Is alcohol, as we're often told, is it a highly addictive substance?
I don't think so.
No, it's not. How could it be? The huge majority of adults drink in the Western world, and the huge majority of them are not alcoholics. Clearly, alcohol is not a highly addictive substance.
How are we defining an alcoholic, though,
That's a very good question.
when you say that?
The dictionary definition has to have, cannot function without it. Drinks regularly, copiously, excessively, and so forth. Which is why you will find somebody who stopped drinking being referred to as a recovering alcoholic. You need that adjective. I'm suggesting we replace recovering with dispositional, but nevertheless, the alcoholic is somebody who needs alcohol. And this is another, I think, important issue I've also raised in the book. We need to separate the various kinds of addictions. We have become so democratic, so egalitarian, that all addictions have become an addiction. People have said to me, it's absurd you criticising drug addicts and alcoholics when you smoke cigarettes. And I said, well, there's no absurdity or hypocrisy in it. Nicotine is not a mood altering or perception shifting substance. It's not like alcohol. It's not like heroin. I mean, people say, oh, I'm addicted to Netflix, or I'm addicted to the show on net, Succession. I'm addicted to Succession. What they mean is, pardon me, come midnight, when they know they should go to bed, they think, oh, fuck it, I'll start and watch another one. Right, this is addiction. You can see the difference between that and using toilet water to fill a syringe to shoot up with heroin because you're so desperate for a hit. There's a massive difference. Yes.
So I guess here you're talking about the difference between addiction and dependency,
Yes.
are you not?
Yep.
So there's a physical element here with heroin and alcohol.
That's right, yes.
There isn't with Netflix.
Absolutely.
It's all psychological.
Yes, if you wanted to concede psychological. And
Yeah.
I mean, peripherally, just to note, I probably would argue that, say, gambling, something else people get addicted to, if you like, but these aren't psychological issues. These are vices. And the gambler's great vice is vanity. They can overcome the odds. Probability, statistics mean nothing to them. They are special. The universe will shine on them. The horse is like running at 32 to 1. But yeah, it's got the same name as my brother. It's going to win. I mean, this is just vanity. Whereas I think alcoholics and drug addicts are driven primarily by sloth, by greed, vanity. Why should I live like everybody else, and so on? And so, in a way, yes, I'm agreeing with you. But I also have reservations about the value of psychology when it comes to looking at addiction as well. I wonder if what we used to call the ancient vices and the ancient virtues shouldn't be called more into play here. Gluttony, avarice, sloth, lust, and their counterbalance of the ancients by loyalty, honour, commitment, duty, love, friendship, generosity, all of these things for the ancients, and that's where I would like to take us, somewhere pre-Christian. Christian morality is a very specific kind of morality, and the ancients, of course, knew nothing of it, and they discussed and debated morality for thousands of years before the Christians arrived. We can get rid of religious thinking, and we can start thinking about why people behave in certain ways, and it can, but it needn't, include psychology. Cowardice is a terrible failing, but it drives alcoholism, in my view. And sloth is embedded in all of the major vices. I've found something I like. Why would I look for anything else? I can't get around that. I like it. I'm not going to do anything else, even though it's killing me. Just a couple of other points before I finish. You've been absolutely delightful, I have to say, delightful.
So have you.
I feel as though there's 40 of you in the room. Where are we? Yeah, just a couple here to finish. You may have come across this before. There was an ad campaign rolled out in Australia when I was down there about 10 years ago, and it posted of a high court judge, he had the rollers in his hair, this kind of stuff, and somebody who was clearly a senior, a female CEO, she had that kind of, look of like, I'm fucking boss here, out all the way down was a guy street sweeps, and a big saying at the top that said, addiction does not discriminate. Right, and we're supposed to deduce from this that lawyers can be alcoholic and etc. all the way down the social classes. To which my response was, it's true, addiction does not discriminate, but that's because it doesn't do anything else either. It doesn't drive a car, it doesn't look after the kids. Addiction doesn't do anything, it's just a word. What you really mean is you will find alcoholics and drug addicts at every level of human society, because we are all weak, imperfect beings. Of course you'll find judges who are alcoholic. That doesn't mean addiction doesn't discriminate. We can't give powers to addiction or alcoholism. In AA, they will say, while you're in the meeting here, alcoholism is out in the car park doing press-ups to get fit to attack you when you come out the door. I mean, this is just horseshit. I've got no problem with AA. I would far sooner people were in a room listening to stuff that were, to my mind, was not particularly intelligent than be in a bar. Society is the winner. AA is free as well. And what a massive bonus to society that is. But they're wrong. They're wrong when they talk of addiction or alcoholism as being cunning, powerful, dangerous. Alcoholism is none of these things. These are human qualities. Substances don't have them. They're just substances. It's us, the interaction with us. We can become cunning and dangerous and so forth with enough alcohol in us. But substances don't. Addiction does not discriminate. No, that's quite right, but only because it can't. All right. Again, you'll see other sayings like, addiction can happen to anyone. No, it can't. It can't happen to anyone. If it could happen to anyone, why doesn't it happen to everybody? Which is the question you asked before. Exactly right, a very sensible question. And that's how this should be counted. It can't happen to anybody because alcoholism and drug addiction are a process through time. I'd just like to finish on this. That narratives of addiction, stories about addiction, are full of images that are spatial. That's to say, of falling. For example, you might get a woman saying, in the depths of my addiction, I became a prostitute. You know, and I read that and say, I'm sorry, you know, I'm sorry that happened. But addiction has no depths. It's a sequence of events, causally connected in time. It doesn't go like that, that's a metaphor. I mean, obviously be on your knees, if you excuse me, sucking a stranger off for 20 quid is pretty low. Of course, we understand that. But still, metaphorically, it's part of a timeline that began with the first shot of heroin. And then she went back for a second, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, until she had a habit. And then the only way she could afford to pay that £300 a day habit was to become a prostitute. Okay, but that, forget depths, that's all about time. And a great deal of the language and imagery used to describe addicted people is designed, I'm saying not out of some conspiracy, but rather laziness on our part. We haven't challenged the medical profession sufficiently. We haven't asked governments what they're doing with our money when it comes to rehab clinics and so forth. And we should be a little more aggressive, I think, when it comes to looking at drug addicts and alcoholics. I'm not suggesting we raise the stigma. What I am saying is we should do what we used to do, which was to express social disapproval. It's not acceptable to be passed out at midday in front of a school, blind drunk. That's just not right. That's where we need to get to, not, as I've seen on some documentaries, not, you poor unfortunate soul, you've done nothing wrong. Yes, you have. You've passed out blind drunk, pissed your pants in front of a class full of kids. That seems like an odd way to end, doesn't it? I do need to end it.